Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing marvelously well. I have the distinct pleasure of sitting here with Mr. Marc Urselli. Marc, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm excellent. I do have to say, I do love everything that's going on where you are sitting. I presume you're sitting at home.
I am at home, yes. Today, no sessions, so I'm here.
Beautiful. And where is home?
Home is in Brooklyn, New York. Half the year, the other half in London.
You're not either English or American, obviously. So I'd love to know, how do you end up living and working over here? Did you build your career back home in Italy and then eventually come here, or did you land here and build it from here?
I started my career in Italy, although I was born in Switzerland. But
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I basically built my career in New York. I came here when I was 21. I was already running a recording studio in Italy for about 2 or 3, 4 years, which was going pretty well. I just felt like I needed to branch out and be outside of my comfort zone. And so I came to New York seeking an internship in a recording studio. And I landed an internship in the recording studio where I'm today the chief house engineer. So I kind of built it up from scratch here. It's EastSide Sound, one of the longest running recording studios in New York, together with Electric Lady. It's been there since 1972, so we're coming up on 50 years.
So as a house engineer, I presume you're bringing in projects there as well as them obviously calling you for projects.
Yeah, absolutely. At the beginning, it was more like the people would call the studio and an engineer would be assigned. If the client didn't have an engineer, then the house engineer, the chief house engineer, in that case me, would be assigned. Over the years, it's turned more into people calling me directly and me taking them there unless they want to go somewhere else specifically.
I remember as a studio owner in the past, I would have these conversations with my co-owners and say, really the business is going to be built around the quality of our engineering staff. You can have an amazing room and a great console, but if you go in there and there isn't somebody who can run it really well, who doesn't know the room, then you're really not going to do well. I think the smartest question I think you can be asked, you tell me, is when somebody comes in and asks you where you would record the drums, as opposed to them deciding.
Right. Yeah, I don't have too many people that are very vocal about where they want to record the drums. They usually know that I've done many, many records there, so they trust me to say, for this, I think you should put him here. For that project, you should put him there. It's usually, only 2 or 3 spots in the studio anyway.
So you come to New York, you start interning. Presumably the next stage is, interning would be running and some assisting.
Yeah, I started as a runner. I was mostly basically fetching coffee for clients, cleaning the toilets, running food orders, all of that. I did that for a long time. Eventually, I started doing some assisting. I did that for a long time, actually, almost 2 years without getting paid a penny. And then my first break was doing a Luther Vandross session when the chief engineer at the time was sick, called in sick and couldn't make it. And I was there already setting up for the session. So that's how it all started.
Did they immediately trust you to do other sessions, or was it just now you've got kind of what was the sort of...
I think at that point they already trusted me, or they wouldn't have let me be there, especially with somebody as famous as Luther. I think it was just the first session where I was completely alone, or where I was in charge, I should say. And so in that sense, the trust was there. It had to be.
So 2 years, though, as a free internship. That's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it wasn't easy. I was living very cheaply, sleeping on the couch of the studio sometimes if the session ran late at night, because I lived very far from the studio. It was not glamorous at all. It's not what people think it is, an internship. I was living off of savings and off of doing some web design on the side. That was, I'm talking about the early 2000s, the internet bubble. I knew or know some web design, so I was doing websites for people here and there.
So you're 2 years in, you do the first session with Luther. What was the sort of next stepping stone from there?
From there, it was just like the owner of the studio, who was the chief engineer, Lou Holtzman, he basically realized that he could trust me to do any session. And so he was going through changes in his life. He was thinking of closing the studio and moving it somewhere else. That was all happening at that time. And so in the meantime, I was basically doing a lot of sessions for different clients of his.
You basically allowed him to keep the studio going and back off a little bit and probably concentrate more on building the business and have somebody do the engineering. That's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. He had people like me in the past, but most of them had one person before me had moved back to Europe. Another person had moved back to the Midwest. So it was the right place at the right time, so to speak, in the sense that he didn't have somebody he could really trust. And in those 2 years, I had learned how to make myself an invaluable asset to him. And he had learned that he could, rely on that asset and not have to worry about a thing.
That's very well put. I say that we currently have 2 interns. And when I speak to them, I say, I am going to spend more time teaching you than you're worth to me. But there will come a point when you're actually worth more to me. And that's when you'll start getting paid, because I'll start looking at it going, wait there. If I lose that person, I'll actually make less money. It's a tough one, because we're living in a world now where all of us, obviously, naturally as human beings, want to be as successful as possible and as quickly as possible. And sometimes you get to a point where you train somebody so they can actually make you money, and that's the point when they leave.
Yeah. I'm painfully aware of that because we get interns all the time at the studio still. Basically, a lot of the interns that we get, which are from audio schools, are people that come with different degrees of knowledge and of experience. Some are appalling, like they learn Pro Tools somewhere on some online course, and they think that that's all there is. And then they get a blank stare in front of the patch bay. Others are very, proactive and have really done their homework, and they come prepared. But there's always a time where they are going to either move on or they're going to be so useful to me that I start paying them. And there's a few of the guys in my team that have reached that level. And so the first thing that I do to give them some work and to test them is I ask them to do setups for me. So basically I send them very detailed notes, and I tell them to go 3 hours before me in and set up exactly those mics and preamps and do the patch bay and do the Pro Tools session, prep and test everything. And then I'll come in still before the artist to make sure that it's all good. That's my way of seeing how much they've understood about everything and how reliable they are to me. And that's the point where if they get everything right, at some point, if I were to call in sick like my boss did when Luther was in, I know that I can call in sick and they can take over.
So that's definitely a great use, because that detail stuff is not to be sneezed at. Probably for a lot of people, they don't fully understand if they've ever been in a real studio or in a classic commercial studio.
Absolutely. And I'll say something else about that. To me, detail-oriented people are the most useful, because the one thing that drives me insane is if I'm asking for something because they don't know all the thought process that goes into it or all the reasons that I might have. They don't know that I might have had a conversation with the artist, and therefore we have come to a conclusion about how to set up something. And so if I'm asking them for something specifically, there's a reason why I'm doing that. And if they do something different because they think it's not important, they're missing the point.
Oh, no, absolutely. I love Phil Ramone's book, his autobiography. And he spends a lot of time just talking about little things like getting the right cup of tea, the right drink, the right this. So when the artist arrives, they feel completely comfortable.
Absolutely.
It's great psychological stuff. You work with incredibly talented musicians. I think something, we've had this nice intro, but I think one of the things that draws me to wanting to talk to you is because you work with not just famous people, you work with incredible players. Navigating that, it's quite intense, because when you're working with somebody young who comes in, they're looking to you completely for guidance, and you get a role that's very easily defined. But when I'm in a room with somebody who might be able to run circles around pretty much everybody else, it's a little daunting because, maybe you're working with this incredible guitar player who last week did an album with Al Schmidt or whoever it might be. Tommy Vicari recorded this string section and now you're in there. Is there any sort of tips or tricks or whatever the right way of asking this question is about working with people when they're working at that kind of high of a level of players?
I don't know if I can point to tips or tricks. I think the most important thing about everything is being prepared. That level of preparedness is really what will make the session run smoother for everyone, including yourself as the engineer. If you go in prepared, you don't have to struggle and you don't have to suddenly think, how do I fix this problem, and get into a problem-solving mode. Those musicians that you mentioned, which I'm privileged to work with, are people that usually know exactly what they want. So it's very easy to find out. Again, comes back to preparedness. Email them, find out what their needs are, and make sure that all their needs are met and beyond. Make sure that if they ask for a guitar amp and with one microphone, you have 2 guitar amps and a couple of microphones to choose from. Little things like that. That's what I mean by being prepared. Being over-prepared is always better.
My guess is, though, with your resume, people are calling you like, hey, I've got a session tomorrow. Are you available? Knowing that you're going to come into a situation and be calm and know how to handle it.
Absolutely.
I think that's what I want to know about when you're walking into a room and you're like, oh, I didn't know there was a quartet. Oops.
Oh, yes. I've had plenty of those sessions. In fact, my dear friend and mentor, Hal Wilner, who sadly passed away of COVID in April, was the perfect example to speak about that kind of session, because Hal strived on chaos and loved to do things last minute. And so, believe me, it was not easy working for Hal. I mean, I love the guy to pieces, and he was an incredible producer, and he taught me so much, and one of the most important people in my life. But he was not good at organizing things. He was not good at telling me ahead of time what was going to happen. And so, for example, I got booked less than 48 hours for a Nick Cave session that was happening in Los Angeles while I was in New York. Hal called me and said, Nick is available day after tomorrow. And he called me in the evening of, the day before. And so I booked a flight to leave at night or to leave early in the morning at 5 a.m. from New York, to be there at 10. And we started a session at 1, I think, so that I have time to get from the airport to the studio. Of course, I immediately got on the phone with the studio and made sure that they would be able to set up things ahead of time. And even so, there's always curveballs with Hal. Hal will tell you there's a guitar player, but then you get there and there's 3 guitar players. Or he'll say there's a string quartet, but then you get there and there's 6 string players, things like that. And that's what I mean by being prepared. With Hal, I always made the input list bigger than what Hal said. I always left holes. If Hal said 2 guitar players, I would make 4, room for 4, and so on and so forth. For pretty much almost every instrument, I would leave a hole in the input list so that I could patch in something right next to it, and I wouldn't find myself with that extra channel at the end of a 70 channel input list, things like that. And with Hal, everything was always so last minute that you had to be that way, or you would just be overwhelmed by the details. It's just that the way Hal worked. I think he kind of loved the spontaneity of what was happening without knowing too much. And, Hal was obviously very famous for putting people together that you would normally think don't belong together, and then magic would happen. That's what he's so special at.
I also feel like being friends with a lot of the classic New York producer and engineers, I think there's also a professionalism level at the New York studios where this isn't such a big deal in their mind, because they're used to having all come up the studio system themselves. They just expect things to be done. I know for Jack, when I'm working with Jack Douglas, I have to tell these guys, Jack's coming in at 12. There better be coffee brewing when he walks in, ready to go. The New York Times better be in front of him where he's going to sit down, and there better be a bowl of nuts that he likes, cashews, just freshly opened, or he's going to think our studio isn't running properly.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing. I think for a lot of these guys is they grew up in that world because, Jack cleaned toilets for years like you did. Jack swept floors. Jack was a tape op. Jack was all these things before he got anywhere near to producer. So he knows the work that comes in. So he's just expecting things like, oh, I need this over here now. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, God, I wish you told me that yesterday. But
that's exactly how it is. And sadly, those kind of people are slowly disappearing. So we're losing a whole piece of that history of, studio life that's gone with, memories.
Yeah, it is very sad. And they're all attached to some of the greatest albums ever made. I want to know a little bit about you growing up. What was the music that inspired you to get into this? Was there a specific artist or something you heard and you were like, what is this? And that led you into wanting to record?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that I find is a constant in my musical life, both as a listener and as an engineer, is diversity, variety. For example, when I was 16 and I started putting together bands, I couldn't make up my mind on whether I would want to have a metal band or a rock band or a funk band. So I did two things. I put together 3 or 4 different bands so I could play all those genres. And then at one point, it dawned on me that I should have a band that would play all of those genres together, and started mixing the genres in a sort of a, what would be called a crossover band in the 90s. As an engineer, the same thing happened. And in fact, I'll say this, I think what led me to become an engineer was the fact that I realized a bulb went off and I was like, if I become an engineer, I can actually work on all these musical genres that I like. Whereas if I stick to being a player, I will eventually have to become good at one thing because you can't be good at everything. And I just was not prepared to make that choice of a genre as a musician. And I realized, wow, an engineer can work on all these genres and can be good at them because it's not as big a difference to engineer different genres as it is to play different genres. Maybe, I'm going out on a limb on that one. And so today, I always say that the one thing, when people look at my credit list, they're impressed because there's a lot of great names. But the thing that I'm most proud of is not one name in particular, but the fact that there's so many genres and names from metal, classical, jazz, rock. I have a little bit of everything in there. And that's what I'm proud of the most.
Scrolling through your All Music, which is very impressive, is not only that there's, lots of great artists of all different genres and periods of time. I mean, I know, like just a couple of years ago, I saw a Mike Love credit. I mean, you've got all periods of all musicians from all different levels of success of all different periods. What most impressed me is there's a lot of work each year. There's that engineering thing that I can see that you're making lots and lots of albums a year. Increasingly now when I look through people's credits, it's cherry picking 1 or 2 major credits a year and lots of downtime, lots of mixing local bands and stuff in between it. There's a lot of very well-known mixers and producers that are saying they're barely doing any major projects anymore. You, on the other hand, even on All Music, which is never complete, I mean, I can scroll here, you're doing 10 albums a year every year. I find that most impressive, that you're working like crazy.
Yeah, I mean, being in a studio environment helps, but also what has changed that level of numbers that you're referring to is the fact that people make records much faster. There are still records like the last record that I did with Hal Wilner, which just came out 3 weeks ago. That took 3 years, but Most records these days are made in a week, especially in the jazz world, which is a lot of the records that I do in the studio, because the studio is, a professional studio, is still being used by most jazz musicians, at least in New York. I end up making records in 2 or 3 days. Those guys, they track in 2 days and we mix in 1 day, and that's usually a record. 3 days is a good average. Rarely goes to 4 or 5. And that's how you make that many records. So in a way, if you count all those jazz records, I probably make 30 or 40 or 50 records a year, because I know, for example, in 2015 or 2015 or 16, I made 15 records with just one artist, John Zorn, who I work with a lot. And that's just one artist, plus all the other records that I work on.
Well, tell us a little bit about that room that you're working in doing those jazz records. Which room is it in the studio?
With the studio, EastSide Sound only has 2 rooms, a Studio A and a Studio B. So the B room is a small production suite with 1 ISO booth, which is used for vocals and little bit of pre-production, things like that, small overdubs. The main studio, Studio A, is a large live room, large control room, and then 6 ISO booths all around the live room. So we're actually the only studio in New York that has 7 isolated spaces in which people can perform at the same time with line of sight. But 4 out of the 6 booths have perfect line of sight with all the other rooms. So it's very conducive to people wanting to play together but having no leakage on their recordings. When we built this studio, which I was part of the design team, we built it in the early 2000s. The studio's been around since 1972, but we moved to a new space 15, 16 years ago. So we designed this room because we kind of foresaw that people are going to want to edit, the bejesus out of their tracks without any leakage. And so we came up with all these isolation booths to facilitate that. And it's been great. And now with COVID, I must say, another strange thing happened. People are realizing that they can use these booths to be socially isolated and do sessions where they don't have to wear a mask because they're in different rooms. Every room has a different air conditioning, intake and out and vent. And so it's great. It's been an asset, actually, even in these COVID times.
That's amazing. What's the console?
The console is a Harrison Series 10. For those who don't know, Harrison is a handmade console in Nashville. The Series 10 is one of the first examples of a digitally controlled analog console. So there's no ADDA. Sound goes in analog, goes out analog, but you can do all the things you can do with a digital console. You can automate faders, you can automate inserts, sends, and you can do that either as a recall with total recall, or you can even automate on the timeline by syncing it with Pro Tools via SMPTE if you want to.
Tell me a little bit about what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. You've been working on this massive project, and this is the project you're saying that just came out a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, it's called Angel-Headed Hipster, the music of Marc Bolan and T-Rex. As the name implies, it's a record that celebrates Marc Bolan, the singer, founder, guitar player, performer of T-Rex. Hal Willner was the producer. It's a record that came out on BMG. We started it 4 years ago. We worked on it for 3 years, and then there were several delays due to different issues. Sadly, came out after Hal passed. It was supposed to come out before, and with these delays, sadly, with COVID and everything, got pushed. So Hal didn't get to see it, but he considered it his best work and called it his white album. And to a degree, in a way, I totally agree with Hal. I also consider it some of my best work.
I opened up the credits here just to give people, we'll have obviously some screenshots going and just give some people some depth of the artists you're working with here. Obviously, huge stars, Mark Almond, obviously, from Soft Cell, an incredible vocalist. Some of these are friends of mine. Jeff Babco's playing piano on there, incredible piano player. So Mark's son is on this, Roland. Hi, Roland. Haven't seen him in years. But then the next B is Bono. So I think that's probably something worth mentioning. That must have been quite exciting, talking of working with insanely talented people.
Yeah. We did a session with U2. U2 and Elton John do a duet on this record.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It's the first time they've done something together. And it was quite a surreal experience. It actually started without Elton. It started with U2. They were doing their tour they were in New Orleans. And this is another typical Hal Wilner thing that happens, I think, with 72 hours. 72 hours prior, Hal said, I got a call from Bono. They have one evening off in their tour. They're going to be in New Orleans, so we should go there and do it there. So we all fly, me, Hal, and Rachel Fox, who's Hal's right-hand manager. We all fly to New Orleans. We book hotels. We basically have to put together everything in 48 hours. And we choose a studio that Hal had worked at prior with Marianne Faithfull, but that was not a commercial studio anymore. It was now some successful songwriter in New Orleans who bought it for himself. And therefore, the live room is full of like 3 or 4 couches, and there's plants everywhere. And it's just basically a glorified living room with an SSL console on the other side of the window. And so I get there at like 8 a.m. because I gathered that it wasn't going to be an easy walk-in. And I spend the next 3 hours clearing out furniture from the live room to make room for U2. And then, 3-4 hours later, U2 is a big machine. So the security comes first to do a walkthrough. Then all the other people start coming. It's a huge machine. Luckily, Rachel Fox was dealing with all the logistics, and I had to deal with only the audio. So the U2 crew came in, they started setting up drums and bass amps and all of that stuff. And from the time Bono, Edge, and Larry and Adam walked in to the time we were done tracking was actually only 3 hours of a very long 12-hour day. But we got great tracks. There's some great stories behind that session. Trombone Shorty was there, along with a horn section of, I think, 5 or 6 people. Hal always joked proudly that he got U2 to do to have a trombone solo on a song of theirs, which had never been done. Hal also joked about the fact that I was able to convince to get Bono into a vocal booth because allegedly, that was my first experience with Bono, so I don't know, but allegedly Bono only records from the control room with an SM58. So of course I did have an SM58 ready by the couch, but I also set up 2 other microphones in a vocal booth and was able to get him in there. Everything went smoothly. The track sounded great. And then The Edge, months later, said, why don't we put Elton John on it? We'd love to do something with Elton. And Elton actually knew Mark Bolan back in the days. And so it was a kind of a match made in heaven. This also kind of came together where Elton was on vacation in the south of France. And so were U2, they're friends. So Hal and I flew to the south of France, recorded in a studio there, and recorded Elton playing piano and doing some singing. And then we all went to lunch, and it's quite surreal how it all came together. I also know I was prepared. But they're used to working with the best people. And so they definitely were making requests at a very fast pace that I had to fill at a very fast pace. So it's definitely a stressful session. I'm not going to lie. The one with Elton John was much more relaxed because it was only Bono and The Edge and Adam came because they happened to be in south of France, but Elton was only playing the piano, and he was only supposed to be playing the piano. Nobody ever said anything about a vocal. I, of course, set up a vocal mic hidden behind the piano just in case anyone would say, so I don't have to go and call the assistant and be like, where do you keep your mics? And where do I find an XLR? And what preamp do you have available? None of that. That goes back to being prepared. So there was a vocal mic. I set it up. I tested it. And I just left it with the boom down behind the piano. And Elton, after playing the piano, he was like, "You guys want some vocals?" And Hal was like, "Of course." And there was the mic, Happened to have a mic right here.
I know exactly what you're saying. I did a session, I talked about this a couple of times, so people will really glaze over, but I did a song with David Foster in Diane Warren's studio. And she had one of those digital SSL consoles. Like, sorry, SSL, I love you dearly. But I'm like, it's like the learning curve from, and it took me a couple of days to get around it. So I just brought in tons of external mic pre's. So when David came in on the first day, I remember him just going, "Oh, I want to play some piano." Mics were already on the piano, and then the band came in and they don't have a bass player. But I rented a flip top and put a FET 47 in front of it. And about halfway through the day, he's like, "Warren, do you know any bass players that you think would be suitable?" And I was like, "I'll see if Sean Hurley's available." And Sean came down and just exactly the same thing. I mean,
had you called Sean before and say, "Hey, I might call you today"?
No, I didn't, because I didn't know whether David was going to have a first call guy. And the thing was, I called Sean, and this is because it took a couple of years for the album to come out, similar story to you. So this was about 3 years ago, and I called Sean, or 4 years ago, in front of David and said, "David wants to know if you could come and play bass." Imagine this conversation. David Foster is producing a Diane Warren song, and he wants to know if you can come and play bass. And as I said that, he goes, "I'm in with Eric Valentine doing Gwen Stefani's record. However, hold on." And and you hear this. "Eric says it's okay. I'll be there in 20 minutes.
Awesome.
This is an incredible lineup. So you've got Elton John, you've got, and this must be the one with Nick Cave on it as well. I see Nick Cave's
Nick Cave is on it. Kesha, Joan Jett, Devendra Benhart, Lucinda Williams, Bournes, Beth Orton. I'm reading. I have it right here. Father John Misty, Perry Farrell, Gavin Friday, Nena, Mark Almond you mentioned. Todd Rundgren is on it. Both Sean Lennon and Julian Lennon are on it. I mean, there's so many amazing artists. This is the cover right here. I got it right here.
That's beautiful. I love the top hat.
Yeah, well, Mark Bolan.
Yeah, the early. What's the early T-Rex cover? It's in black and white with T-Rex written in red, and he's wearing the top hat. Yeah,
totally. I mean, all those record covers are so iconic, and then people like Slash go out and make a career out of wearing a top hat.
Yeah.
That's where that comes from. Came out Record Store Day on August 29th
nice.
as a limited edition, and then the regular editions came out September 4th. Yeah.
Oh, so yeah, just a couple of weeks ago. All right, well, we'll make sure there's a link down below. We'll have a streaming link, and then wherever you can buy it from down there as well. That's pretty darn exciting. And had you finished the mixes though before Hal died? Had he heard all the final mixes?
Oh yes. The record was done about a year ago. Actually, we turned it in. There were just some delays due to contracts and licenses and things like that. When you're working on a record that has 26 tracks, and out of 26, basically 20 are very famous people. People like Rachel Fox, who I mentioned earlier, was Hal's right-hand person, end up spending, a year drafting contracts, and so that's why it took so long.
I can only imagine. I see Dyke Parks on piano. That's fantastic.
Van Dyke and Hal were very close friends. So,
oh, beautiful. I got to work with him and the Thrills. He did string arrangement on 2 songs. Cool. 2003, 2004. He was great. He came down to the studio, sat with the band, grilled them, wanted to get inside their heads.
Yeah, he's very sweet. He's such a character. I love it.
Oh, yeah. He's everything you want. You have these ideas of like the Beach Boys in the 60s and all the crazy, and he's definitely that guy.
Yeah, it's funny because I worked with the Beach Boys for 6 months, and then worked with Mike Love, like you mentioned earlier, on something he put out recently. But I never met Van Dyke until, through Hal, I met Van Dyke. And so, like you said, you have this idea, but it's something completely different, He's not at all what you'd expect.
He doesn't disappoint.
Absolutely not.
Oh, Pete Thomas on drums?
Yeah.
Incredible.
Pete Thomas actually was we basically, the record was done over such a long time that we had different rhythm sections. But Pete was on, I would say, at least half of this record, because we tracked.
Oh, fantastic.
We tracked about half of the record in LA and the other half in New York. And then there were these, more weird sessions like the U2 thing that happened in New Orleans. But otherwise, mostly LA at Village Recorders, mostly, some at Sunset Sound. And in New York, we did some at EastSide Sound, the studio where I work at, and some at Sears Sound, another beautiful room in New York. So those are the 4 main studios that we employed.
So the fan question would be like, what sort of memories, is there any kind of fun stories or memories you have from it that you'd like to share, that you feel is okay to share?
I mean, nothing happened that was weird or out of the ordinary. There are things that happened that I can't talk about, but I would say that the U2 thing, I already told you the story. That was one of the most action-packed days. The very first session that I did for this record was the one with Nick Cave. And speaking of fan, I'm a huge Nick Cave fan. So that was the moment for me. Yes, U2 are, humongous fame, and I was definitely nervous. But Nick Cave is somebody whose records I listen to, whose shows I go to all the time. I really love Nick Cave as an artist. So going to that session was definitely, and it was also the first session. So it was the beginning of a very long, I didn't know it was going to be a 3-year long process making this record. But that session was incredible. It was at Village Recorders. It was in the smaller room, Studio A, not the bigger Studio C.
Oh, the little Neve room.
The little Neve room, which only has one ISO booth. And it was also because it was the first session that I was doing with Hal, not with Hal, but with Hal for this record, I didn't know what approach Hal wanted to take on this record, because I'd worked with Hal before on other records, and we'd done drums in the big room because we're going for the big rock sound. And so I set up the drums in the big room, and then Hal came in and was like, no, I don't want to do that. And there's an example of not having enough information. So I had to switch the drums and throw the drums into the ISO booth, which in Studio A is actually pretty small, but the drummer was cool. He was basically almost with his back against the wall, but we made it happen. But what that allowed for is having the actual live room with everyone in playing at the same time. So if you listen to that Nick Cave song, and in fact, there's a video on it on YouTube, which you can go look at, you'll see that except for the bass clarinet, everything is happening live in the moment together. And that includes Nick singing and playing the piano at the same time. There's a string section right next to him. There's Frank Zappa's bass player. There's 2 guitar players. And there's, I believe, an upright bass player as well. And everything is happening at the same time, completely live. And that kind of launched us into this record in a way that was just unique and special.
That's crazy. And you mastered it down the street from me with Howie.
With Howie, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Todd Rundgren. How did that happen?
Todd is another, pretty much almost everyone on this record is on this record because they were friends with Hal. Musicians just trusted Hal. They kind of looked at him like what he was, a wizard of musical knowledge, And so I don't know how Todd and Hal knew each other, but basically Hal was one of the people that would just call people up and be like, hey, I'm doing this. Do you want to be a part of it? And people would say yes, most of the time. I know of only one major artist that turned this down. I'm not going to say who it is, but he basically said to Hal, I was never really a T-Rex fan, and that's fine. But everyone would jump up and be like, yeah, I'm totally down. And after Hal called Todd, he then called Donald Fagen. So if you look at the credits, Donald is on playing piano on the track with Todd Rundgren. And it's just, and that's another session where everything happened at the same time, live. Another thing that Hal would do is he would call multiple artists. So he would record multiple, the famous artists, meaning not the famous, but the lead singer, so to speak, on the same day with the same rhythm section. So he would book a studio and he would book a rhythm section and an arranger, but then he would call, in that case, I believe it was Todd Rundgren and Emily Haynes, if I remember correctly, were done on the same day. They just came in at different times of the day and did their song, but the rhythm section is the same. There was another day where we had, I think we had Joan Jett, Lucinda Williams, and Beth Orton on the same day with the same rhythm section in New York. And Hal would just do it in a way that sometimes they would overlap and they would just check out each other's session. And it was really fun that way. A funny thing, I'll tell you a funny thing that happened. Kesha, when we were, I forget who we were recording, but we were at Village Recorders and recording one of the people for this session. And I go out to go to the bathroom. And you've been to Village, so when you go out, you kind of walk past the main desk there.
Yeah.
And there's Kesha all glittered up because she's doing some kind of presentation of her new record, I believe, or she's about to. So there's cameras, there's a red carpet outside. And she sees me walk out of the studio and she goes like, hey, what are you guys doing in there? I'm like, why is the person that's doing the, multi-million-dollar record and doing her thing want to know what we're doing? And I said, we're doing a T-Rex tribute record. And she was like, oh, I love T-Rex. Please, can I come listen? I was like, let me just go talk to Hal real quick. And I call Hal and I was like, Kesha's outside and would love to come in and listen. And it was like, of course. And that's how that happened. Like, Kesha is one of the few people, I think, on this record that didn't know Hal until they randomly met that way at Village Recorders. And she ended up on opening the record. She's on the first track, Children of the Revolution.
How do you go from, 8 people fighting to want to do the same song? I mean, Life's a Gas is another beautiful one. Lucinda Williams on that makes perfect sense. Bang a Gong, Get It On, of course, is huge single. Yeah, how do you manage what everybody wants to do?
Well, Hal would be in charge of choosing songs and artists. And he was very good. One of Hal's great talents was sequencing records. There would be jobs, records that he was not producing, but he was called upon to just sequence them because he was so good at that. And so he had usually very clear ideas about what person would work for what song. He's kind of like a movie director who envisions an actor for a part. There's obviously exceptions, and you just mentioned Bang a Gong. That's one exception where we first tracked Bang a Gong with David Johansen, the singer of the New York Dolls. And we tracked it, and if you listen on the record, it's kind of like a swing version of it. And then Bono sends Hal a video of him on his private jet rocking out to Bang a Gong. The video, Hal showed me this video, and it's hilarious because I think Bono doesn't say, I want to do this song. Bono just sends a video of him rocking out to the song. And so clearly that's the song he wants to do. And you're not going to tell Bono, no, you can't do that because it's already been done. That's how we ended up with two of the same on the record. So it can definitely happen that there's overlap. But for the most part, Hal would choose the right person for the song.
That's great. Now I'm going to go and listen to those back to back to see how both artists interpret it. It's been out for a couple of weeks. Where do you go from here? What do you got next? What are you working on?
Well, I got back to New York after 6 months in Europe. I spent the COVID lockdown in London and in Italy, where I'm from. So I was working from home in London, obviously, like everyone during COVID. And now that I'm back in New York, I've started doing sessions again in the studio. The studio reopened July 1st with all the proper protocols of, distancing, hand sanitizers, wiping off the microphones before every session, things like that. So I'm starting to book sessions again, and I'm doing one with John Zorn this Thursday and Friday. Typical example of what I mentioned, a record that's going to be tracked in 2 days. It's a record with Bill Frisell on guitar and John Medeski on piano, Carol Emanuel on harp, and Kenny Wallison on vibraphone. So it's going to be a quartet. That's the next thing I'm doing, and then we'll be mixing that. And then I also do a ton of mixing from home. So a lot of artists that I never meet or that live in other places or that simply cannot afford a studio like EastSide Sound but still want me to mix their tunes, I do those from home. I'm doing right now 3 records at the same time. I'm mixing a doom metal record for a band from Norway called Superlinks, a great female-fronted doom metal trio that I saw at Inferno Festival in Oslo. I just loved the band, went up to talk to them, and we kept in touch. And then I'm doing a hard rock band from LA, just an EP for them. And then I'm doing kind of like a ambient / industrial / indie pop album for a band from Italy. So a little bit of everything.
Eclectic and I love it.
That's eclectic amazing. Is the name of the game.
I think I probably, before we go, I forgot to ask you about the album you did as an artist with quite an eclectic group of people. Lee Ronaldo, yourself, and I don't want to butcher.
Balazs Pandi is how you pronounce his last name. I don't do a lot of records as an artist because I don't think myself highly enough as a musician. I think myself mostly as an engineer and as a producer. But I do love playing with people, and I've known all 3 of those people, but had worked with those people in different capacities, but we never done anything together. And it was funny, I was on the Great Wall of China about 3 years ago, and I got a text from Balazs saying, "Hey, I'm going to be in town next week," because Balazs, I should say, lives in Hungary, and he's a drummer. And so he said, "I'm going to be in New York next week. You want to hang out?" I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." And he says, "We should really do something together. We've been talking about it for years." And it just dawned on me there on the Great Wall of China. I was like, "Let me get back to you on that." And I sent a text to Lee Ronaldo, who's the guitar player in Sonic Youth. And I sent a text to Jim Jarmusch, who's the film director. And I said, "Hey, I want to do this session. Are you down to come and play?" And that's how it happened. We just got together. We played, some good stuff came out of it. And so we put out a record on the Austrian label Trost Records that came out 2 years ago. And we're going to put out a new one probably next year. And since, if you allow me to speak about what I do as an artist, I'll also mention that next year, a record that I'm very proud of is coming out. I've been working on this record for the better part of probably half a dozen years. It started as a metal record with me playing drums and bass, which I normally never do. I just had this idea and I put down the ideas as demos, which then were exactly what I wanted. And so I kept them. And then I started contacting all these throat singers from all over the world, but mostly Mongolia, Tuva, and Siberia. For the listeners who don't know what throat singing is, it's a technique where you basically sing from your chest and you do multiple notes that overlap each other with your throat. It's really interesting. It's amazing sounding. I almost always thought that it's a great compliment to slow doom metal. And I put the two together and I contacted all these great doom metal guitar players like Matt Pike from Sleep and High on Fire, Steve Von Till from Neurosis, all these great guys, put them all on the same record, found a label for it, and that's going to come out next year.
That sounds pretty crazy. I'd love to hear that. So please, if you can, get me an MP3. I want to see what that sounds like.
I will. Sounds good.
That's amazing. Marc, thank you ever so much.
You're
I
very
really
welcome.
appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So everybody, just leave some comments and questions below. I really appreciate. It's been a lot of fun, and I don't know. Hopefully, let's do it again. I feel like I just scraped the surface. I realized there was about 20 other conversations we could have had, but let's save it for another one.
Whenever you want, I'm happy to be back.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing.